we continue to fund this program which attempts to tell the British people that reading C.S. Lewis is going to radicalise you more than the hadiths. And I wonder why. We'll get onto what network might be in the Home Office shortly, but I want to draw your attention to this book here. Now, this is Laura Dodsworth, who's been on Dan's show before, Brokenomics, so I'm planning to have her on this show at some point, where pertinent. I just thought I'd lay the groundwork here. This is State of Fear. She wrote it about the COVID-19 pandemic and the psychological warfare operations waged on the British public by the 77th Brigade, that will be coming up later, or SAGE, an independent SAGE, certainly not independent, run by Communist Party member Susan Michie, or the Cabinet Office, or the Nudge Unit. Various psychological warfare strategies were deployed to get the public to comply with social distancing measures, lockdowns, mask mandates, and Boris Johnson even floating the prospect of mandatory vaccinations. I'm mentioning Laura Dodsworth's book because she dives into Raikou. And so I'm going to read some quotes from here to act as a primer as to what Raikou is, right? Reminder, Raikou stands for the Research, Information and Communications Unit. Sounds very banal, but it's within the Home Office. She says, after the terror attacks on London Bridge in 2017, there were bunches of flowers and graffiti messages of solidarity behind the cordons at the scene of the attack. On social media, there were outpourings of support and positively themed hashtags, such as hashtag Turn to Love, hashtag for London, and hashtag Love Will Win. The media resounded with comments from faith leaders and politicians, faith leaders being imams. You probably thought all of this was spontaneous. Some of the flowers might have been. The British public is generous and demonstrative. But much of the response was reportedly pre-planned by the UK government. Middle East Eye, who we'll be getting onto shortly, has broken important stories about the UK's staged campaigns to manage the public response to terror attacks through Raikou, the government counter-terror PSYOPs unit, and Breakthrough Media, an agency which has undertaken various campaigns on Raikou's behalf. And I would like to say, I have spoken to someone that has filmed stuff on behalf of Raikou. I am not naming them, but they have confirmed what they filmed and what it was used for. And it was used to gaslight the public in the aftermath of a terror attack to convince them that there are just these integrated, spontaneous communities of female Somali football teams just popping up all over the country. And therefore, a guy walking into a pop concert with a nail bomb that the British taxpayer had paid for through his social housing and benefits and killing a bunch of girls is just fine. That is the level the government has sunk to, right? And I mentioned the Manchester Arena attack, because we'll be coming on to that in a moment. All of the tactics are guided by the government's desire for controlled spontaneity, that's the term, to facilitate recovery and to prevent civil unrest in response to terror attacks. Disaster and recovery planner Lucy Easthope wrote for The Guardian that the I heart messages that appeared in cities in the wake of a terrorist attack are not always spontaneous, but, quote, carefully planned in advance. She and Dodsworth spoke numerous times during the course of researching her book. Easthope will come up again later. Now, I covered this in relation to COVID last year with ITV's COVID drama. But in light of recent events, especially the Southport murders and the subsequent protests, some of which turned violent, especially when Keir Starmer, Nick Lowles and the like incited Muslim mobs to come out with weapons to harass journalists, attack pubs and lacerate the livers of pubgoers, it's worth covering this because the PSYOPs that have been rolled out since to contain the civil unrest smell exactly like what was done during COVID. Now, here's what Raikou is according to far-right conspiracy outlet The Guardian. Back when the Tories were in charge of it, they were very critical. There were hearings with the Home Affairs Select Committee in Parliament that unveiled a lot of what Raikou was doing back in 2016. Everyone should be familiar with Raikou from now on. So keep them in mind anytime you see a coordinated media effort around an organic wellspring of rage against a terror attack by the British public. So The Guardian writes, Raikou is based in the Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism, the OSCT, in the Home Office's Westminster HQ. Charles Farr, a former MI6 officer and head of the OSCT, set up Raikou shortly after arriving at the Home Office in 2007. So it was set up under the Blair government. Raikou was modelled on the Information Research Department, the IRD, a propaganda unit established in 1948 by the Attlee government after the Second World War. The IRD's exploits included hoodwinking journalists and academics and targeting trade unionists before it was shut down in 1977. So it was an anti-socialist Cold War propaganda unit. Some of the unit's funding came from the budget for Prevent. They're intertwined. The controversial counter-radicalization program. The funding has risen steeply. For 2015 to 2016, when this was written, the unit's budget was 17 million, more than 5 times as much 3 years earlier. When the Home Office revised Prevent in June 2011, this was after the Cameron election, it declared Raiku's impact had been variable, and that more effort to, quote, identify credible partners and develop powerful narratives and, quote, more professional counter-narrative products was needed. So by the end of the year, they hired a gentleman called Richard Chalk. Richard Chalk was a former 1997 Conservative Party candidate. Then he went to work in Baghdad during the Iraq War for a PR firm called Bell Pottinger. Some of his work still remains classified, according to The Guardian. He then came back from Baghdad and was immediately appointed Chief of Staff to the Conservative Party chair, now Baroness Saida Warsi. The Home Office then says he was hired to head Raiku because of his expertise in counter-terrorism strategic communications. Quote, under Chalk's leadership, Raiku began communicating with British Muslims in a manner more reminiscent of counterinsurgency operations than a traditional public information campaign. Now, I detailed Warsi's attempts to liaise with Muslim community groups throughout her time in the Conservative Party before she became a baroness. In this segment here, I believe this was late last year. No, it was early this year, about Scotland's hate crime laws that then I mutated into covering the attempts by Michael Gove and Rishi Sunak to bring in Muslim community groups to have interfaith dialogue discussions about clamping down on extremism, which ended up just being the far right, despite the main problem being the pro-Palestine protests. It is worth reiterating that Saida Warsi was accused of providing cover to Islamic extremists to liaise with the Home Office. I believe one group that she tried to talk to was connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. But it's worth reiterating that she won a £20,000 libel payment and got an apology from Colonel Richard Kemp after Kemp wrote an article in Jewish News that accused her of essentially trying to provide cover for Islamists. So I must stress that any liaison with an extremist group that Saida Warsi had, groups that she described as, although not illegal, clearly illiberal, is purely accidental, and she engaged with them on the best possible faith terms. It is unfortunate that not everyone else in the Home Office is like Saida Warsi, because now there is a Islamic network within the Home Office looking to advance Muslim interests. And we wonder why Prevent has been a lot softer on extreme Muslim groups, but almost unanimously cracking down on the far right to the extent of where they're proscribing The Lord of the Rings. A Home Office Islamic network, and this is reporting thankfully done by my good friend Stephen Edgington, who you should all follow on Twitter because you'll be able to see his latest exposés, which I often provide commentary for on GB News. He writes, a Home Office Islamic network aims to recruit Muslim staff and, quote, influence policymakers to support Muslim needs. This investigation can reveal leaked documents show the group of 700 civil servants. 700 civil servants are working to advance Muslim interests against the interests of the native population, whom have different ethnic and cultural ties and a completely different and antithetical religion to these people. So there are 700 seditionists within the Home Office setting government policy. Makes you think. They say they aim to, quote, promote the recruitment, retention and progression of Muslim staff in the Home Office and, quote, influence policymakers so that policy is more inclusive of Muslim needs. So they're a Muslim pressure group within the Home Office. GB News has seen a list of their aims, published on an internal government website, which also include to, quote, promote a clear understanding of generic Islam, quote, provide advice and guidance to senior civil service management on religious issues that affect Muslim staff, and, quote, facilitate and support Home Office engagement with external stakeholders from Muslim communities. So Muslim pressure groups who may well have some unsavory views and connections. I mean, it wasn't long ago that Hizb ut-Tahrir were not a proscribed group, were actively agitating during the pro-Palestine protests for Muslim armies to rise up in the UK to overthrow British democracy. And I believe that Keir Starmer, in his capacity as a lawyer, defended Hizb ut-Tahrir and prevented them from being proscribed. So, I'm just saying, there might well be people in the Home Office, any of these 700 employees that is working with groups that have connections to potential or past Islamic terrorists. We know Sadiq Khan had a career history of defending the one surviving 9/11 hijacker / planner, defending and trying to bring to the UK Louis Farrakhan, sharing a stage with people who had connections to the training ground that developed the 7/7 bombers. It's often that motivated Muslim interest groups are only one or a couple spheres removed from actual terrorists. And yet, they're not the ones monitored, they're the ones setting policy. According to the leaked documents, the Home Office network, set up in 2005, so predating Prevent, does not allow non-Muslim staff to become full members. They can sign up to be associate members only. So it is an ethnic and religious protection racket setting policy within the Home Office. A Home Office whistleblower told GB News, quote, "Having an Islamic lobby group inside the Home Office represents a serious threat to the government's aims in combating Islamic extremism and granting asylum to those fleeing Islamic countries over religious persecution. The network has already produced pro-hijab propaganda, which it sent to asylum seeker decision makers in the Home Office, and explicitly states its aims to influence policy to support their religious goals." So do you think this might have something to do with the controlled spontaneity efforts in the aftermath of terror attacks? What are these, you ask? Well, here's this famous Middle East Eye article that both I and Callum have brought up before on the podcast, but again, I wanted to cover it to create a one-stop resource for you to consult. The Home Office and Raiku conduct PR campaigns in the aftermath of Islamic atrocities to reduce the backlash against government policies, including mass immigration and an increase in the Islamic population, as well as the codification of their privilege to be immune from criticism in law with Islamophobic blasphemy laws, and with preferential treatment with finance by the Bank of England, making them immune from things like stamp duty tax when buying a house. So internal Raiku documents seen by Middle East Eye say the unit are working, quote, at an industrial scale and pace to develop messages that, quote, affect attitudinal and behavioural change, particularly among Muslims. The involvement of the UK government is rarely acknowledged. In operations that contingency planners term, quote, controlled spontaneity, politicians' statements, vigils, and interfaith events are also negotiated and planned in readiness for any terror attack. The campaigns that have been deployed during every UK terrorist incident in recent years, including the London Bridge attack in 2017 and the Finsbury Park mosque attack that took place 2 weeks later. Within hours of an incident, campaigns are swiftly organised, with I Heart posters designed and distributed according to the location of the attack. Plans are drawn up for people to hand out flowers at the scene of the crime in apparently unprompted gestures of love and support. The purpose of these operations, according to a number of people involved in their creation who spoke to Middle East Eye, is to shape public responses, encouraging individuals to focus on empathy for the victims. Empathy for the victims to tell them to not look back in anger. To tell them we shouldn't have any prejudice against the faith and ethnic group that the attackers are reliably coming from, as the families of the victims of the other Borough Market stabbing, the Cambridge PhD students I'm thinking of, that brought their stabber to a conference as an example of what rehabilitation can do, in a feat of bitter irony. Or in 2022, when Valdo Calacane killed 2 students and elderly caretaker, the families that were trotted out in front of banners that said "Love wins" and told to have no hate for any particular ethnic group, as their children's bodies were even barely cold. As Dan has often said, you have to wonder just how psychopathic the intelligence assets that tell the families to do that really are. Do you want to be the person that goes and knocks on the door of a grieving parent and tells them you must affirm the multicultural narrative as your child lies on a slab because one of the imported diversity groups has killed them, either because they're a delusional schizophrenic or an Islamist? This is what the government's doing. This is what our taxpayer cash is doing. Sickens you, doesn't it? Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m, only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.